I thank you very much for that invitation, and I have to say that once Klaus Offe called me and asked me if I would be ready to have a small contribution to that conference. Of course, I couldn't deny, not only because it's a very interesting subject, but also, of course, because of Klaus Offe, and in fact, I'm very happy to be here. And the title you might have read of what I wanted to say to you is slightly different from this term of public sphere, because I use the term political, what belongs to the political sphere, and they are of course related to each other, but they are not completely the same. I would like to have just two small remarks before I start to present some reflections. The one is there couldn't be a better moment, I think, to start thinking about these issues than these days. With all the disadvantages we have of an economic crisis, they have the advantage that the problem is very sharply given to our eyes, how we should make the difference between public and private. And I could imagine that 3 weeks ago the public would have answered to that question differently than it would answer now. And I came back this morning, and being the plane, had the time to read a number of newspapers. I was quite deeply impressed by the comment on the first page of the Handelsblatt. And this is a newspaper which is very narrowly related to privatization strategies and market ideas. But this comment said that one has, of course, to rethink the public role in regulating markets and taking over responsibility. I have to say that I have taken immediately that first page of the Handelsblatt in order to be ready afterwards to cite it, let me say, within 5 months. So this present public discussion and the experiences we are having, and nobody knows how tomorrow, what results will have come tomorrow to our minds about the development of the economy, is, I think, really sharpening our eyes for the point of that issue. And that brings me to the second remark, because Jürgen Kocher, you have spoken about the 68 generation, and it came to my mind that I would like to ask myself, what is your Erkenntnisinteresse? You know that in these days, are you interested in having that theme of the conference? Of course, the 68ers sometimes repeated that question to an extent that one couldn't hear it anymore. But I think it's important, and it would be good. It would be a good contribution also to nowadays teaching in universities and everywhere else to put the question, what is your Erkenntnisinteresse? And I had the impression, unfortunately I couldn't attend the previous session, but I had the time to read through the paper of Klaus Offe, and my impression is that your Erkenntnisinteresse is to gain weight again for political discussion and political decision making versus privatization and market decision making. I hope I'm right with this idea of your Erkenntnisinteresse. So, what belongs to the political sphere? This is, of course, not a mere analytical or descriptive question, but it is a normative question. To give a normative answer, we are told that there is no political science, and no science at all, which could give you the base for a normative answer. But it might give us the base for a good and reasonable argument. And again, Jürgen Kocher spoke about the discussion and the development of discussions. And I think the idea behind, again, was that discussions mean to put forward arguments, measuring them from a certain criteria of common good, because, of course, this is an ideal type of it, but the contribution of discussion to public sphere and then to political sphere is to find out by arguments, Habermas, etc., which decision making would be the best for the common good. So, what belongs to the political sphere? As it is a normative question, I try first to go through some previous and very, very fundamental and basic reflection about it. And I think if you go to the history of ideas, to find out what belongs to the political sphere was the content of what we called social contracts. And the fundamental aim of social contracts was, since at least the 17th century, to find ways to guarantee freedom and security. These are the most important aims of a community when they want to live together. Freedom and security. There might be complete, different and even opposed answer to that question. You know that Thomas Hobbes gave a totally different answer than John Locke. But the main issue was freedom and security. And I think that went on through the next centuries with a lot of differentiations, but the main point, as I see it, is freedom and security if we want to define what belongs to the political. We can also define political in opposition to private. Not so much, I think, to individual, but to private. Because private means exclusion from the sense of the word. Privare, that means that I exclude somebody or a group of people. Whereas political means inclusion. It's the total polity which is included. That might also be one way to approach the definition of what is political. But I would like to go to that fundamental aim of a polity, namely to guarantee freedom and security. And depending on what are your first presuppositions of personal and human behavior, if you think like Thomas Hobbes, that the main and fundamental instincts are to augment your power in order to survive against a world of fools, then of course to secure and to guarantee freedom and security, you need a very, very strong state, the Leviathan, in order to suppress any private or citizen initiative to imply power. So, and John Locke, of course, had a different view about it. He didn't think that people are from the beginning fools to each other. He didn't think that their main instincts are to gain as much power as possible in order to be able to overcome any enemy. But he thought that people would be amongst each other friendly and could be friendly, but there are always some, as he defines it in the second treatise, there are always some who transgress the borders of legal and friendly life, and therefore we need the state in order to enforce the law. So, guarantee freedom and security, not only in the legal sense, but more also in the material, the economic, and the social sense. And until the midst of the 20th century, this idea of the purpose of a polity grew and gained more and more ground. And you mentioned Colin Crouch, he also thinks that the 70s, the 60s and the 70s were, so to say, the high time of democracy, whereas afterwards, for a number of reasons, this social contract being at the base of a working democracy would more and more lose ground. Why did it lose ground? I think in the 80s, the main important point was that the economic field, that companies could transgress national borders and therefore were not anymore really reacting to state politics. This is a very common point. I don't think I have to elaborate on that. But when that experience was made that the national state, which was the main material, substantive entity to practice freedom and democracy and to practice politics, that the national state was not anymore able to really implement and to fulfill the aims he was thought of and expected at. A new wave came up, and I think Klaus Offe also developed that in his presentation in the previous session. Step by step, a new ideology gained ground that it would be better to replace the state by the market. So the balance between public and private, between state and market, went to the side of the market. And without having really conceptualized this tendency, a general presupposition was that the more you would privatize, the more flexible everything would go, the more the consumers would be satisfied, the more efficient agency could behave. To the extent that, in a way, politics became a remaining, just a small remaining field, at least in that concept. And the result of it was, during the last decennies, that the social discrepancies within also the developed and industrial societies, but also between the industrial world and the second and third world, the third world, these discrepancies became deeper and deeper, and injustice, injustice went up. You can see that with the taxes went down, and also the ratio of worker salary in comparison with the salaries of independent people, and especially the managers, what we call in German the Lohnquote. I'm not quite sure what that is in English for the moment. The Lohnquote went down. If this very rough characterization of what has happened during the last 20 years is true, one has, of course, to think again, what can re-strengthening of the political sphere do with this result? Does politics mean that everything would get just again, that everything would be common good oriented, that we would again come to a wonderful world? Of course not. I remember a contribution of Ralf Dahrendorf in the WZB, I think 2 years ago, when he reminded the public that Tony Blair, who certainly favored privatization, at a certain point recognized that deregulation, and that was the key word for privatization and for depolitization, that deregulation has to be replaced by better regulation, which meant that you cannot do without regulation, that you only have to think of the quality of that regulation. And so I think this was already a first step to recognize that the withdrawal of the state, the withdrawal of the public sphere, does not have the positive consequences those who preach for it presented and expected. By the way, and this might be a connection to the title of that conference, namely namely the decline and rise of public spheres. We could observe that to put forward the question of justice, to ask if a decision had been just or not, was very often encountered by the argument that this would be an ideological dealing with the question, that the market would be the institution which would best serve to find just solution, with the tendency to kind of tabooing the question for justice, saying that the market would best decide what should be the relationship between performance, between Leistung and the compensation. So I think the loss, or even the tendency to prohibit putting forward the question of justice showed that the public sphere has a relation with justice. You might remember the sentence of Immanuel Kant in what is the English title of the Streit der Fakultäten, the dispute of the, I don't know, faculties or departments, in which he said, I have to translate that into English, that decisions which need the public to be really implemented have a good chance to be just. So the test or the filter for justice would be the publicity, transparency, of course, and the public debate. And this is, of course, also behind your expectation of the public sphere. Now, I think the crisis we are gotten in, the crisis we can observe just these days, has very strongly shown the necessity of rethinking the fundamental idea to replace most functions of the state by the market. And it is in fact very impressive to see how quickly people who 2 or 3 months ago didn't want to have the state interfering into the economy just ask for state interference, just ask even for kind of nationalizations in a very pragmatic way, without just thinking of what they have said 2 or 3 months before. Why are they asking for the state? Why have we now this tendency of the state to interfere with economics? Many analyses show that the present economic crisis is not just a technical economic crisis, but is a fundamental cultural crisis and is a crisis of trust. I ask myself, how come that the banks who have worked by reciprocal trust do not trust anymore to each other? Is it just because the future is unknown? Or do they know that their practices have in fact not been trustworthy? And now the whole thing has started. They know what they knew before, that they did not behave in a trustworthy way. And the last remarks of a number of private bankers, that they have transferred their money to Sparkassen, which were, so to say, the little children and not well-respected children within the banking sector, because they think that their money is better and more secure, shows that there could be a better reciprocal trust if the banks had behaved trustworthy before. Why have these bankers who ask for the intervention of the state, why do they think that the state is more trustworthy? Everybody knows that the guarantee our Chancellor and our Minister of Finance has given for the accounts in the banks is just a symbolic guarantee. It's completely irrelevant if they say if it is for 1 billion or 1.5 billion, because it only works if it is not used. So, the only guarantee they give is a symbolic one. And why should we trust them? And why should we trust the state? We could say because the state is a state and can't get bankrupt. But we see a small state, Iceland, which seems to be on the road to getting bankrupt. So even the state can go bankrupt. Can the Federal Republic go bankrupt? We would say, well, it's large. It's a large country. Can a large country go bankrupt? Why is there a better chance that we can trust the state than a big company? I would say that in spite of all the criticism which have been brought forward against the state, the chance that the state is a little bit more common good oriented than a private company is better. So, the trust is related to a little bit more of common good orientation, to a little bit more of justice. And this is very, very reasonable. We know that if we try to define trust or a trustworthy person, we can see very easily that a trustworthy person has to be a little bit competent. If the person is silly, it's very difficult to trust. But also that this trustworthy person has to be truth-related and just. If you have a person who is very, very clever, but from whom you know that just particularistic interests are orienting that person, you do not trust that person, because these interests might diverge from yours. So I would say, although our modern democracies, and Colin Crouch describes it, are distrusted in the sense of not being sufficiently just, common good oriented, etc., they do that more than the clearly and openly particularistic and interest, in the sense of particular interest oriented companies. And so I think if we want to really rebuild trust, and this is the 100 billion question we have for the moment, the only way is to find institutions and persons who would behave that way, and to enlarge the domain and enlarge the competences of politics and of the policy. What could be concepts of politicization and not depoliticization in the sense of democratic politics under the condition of a globalized economy? It is certainly not sufficient just to give moral statements and to charge people who have been responsible for the disaster we are experiencing for not having behaved morally. Certainly they have not behaved morally, that's true, because, for instance, they have traded with goods which they did not know, which they did not check. They, in a way, have just tried to trade for a short period, to trade with them and then to leave them to the next, leave the risk and everything which is bad is always good to the next, just in order to have a short period of profit, which is certainly not a responsible behavior. But this is not sufficient. I think we will have to rethink democratic politics under the condition of economic globalization. And what I would like to put forward is, in a way, connecting to what Jürgen Kocher said about civil society, but also disconnecting in the sense that I think democratic politics cannot follow anymore the idea of a political, professionalized political sphere on the one hand and the public on the other. As public which observes, which criticizes, which discusses, which argues, but which does not constructively interfere. Jürgen Kocher, with his huge knowledge about civil society, has defined civil society for certain, while in this historic experience as a sphere where groups would be more or less fundamentally anti-capitalist and also in a sense anti-market, and very critical towards what remained from the democratic state. On the other hand, you have defined the civil society and their organizations as more or less common good oriented, at least in their intentions. I would think that civil society organizations are not, from the beginning, common good oriented. They are simply initiatives which are not initiated by the states and which are not private economic companies which are organized in order to have some profit. Although you could say that even the private sector is part of the civil society in that sense that it is not part of the state. But I would make the difference between the private sector in the sense of the economic sector and civil society initiatives, and to say it drastically, the mafia or the Ku Klux Klan in a formal definition could be defined as civil society. And I would not see any contributions of these kinds of NGOs to a democratic politics. I say that because there are many people who criticize the possible contribution of civil society and NGOs to democratic politics, saying that they are not all good. That's true. They are not all good. They can only contribute to democratic politics if they behave in the senses of fundamental democratic rules and fundamental democratic values and aims, which I don't have to describe because everybody knows what I'm thinking about. So, what I think could help us to repair the situation, and every crisis might be good in the sense that it gives us chances of not only new experiences but also new insights and new activities. I think one could come to a worldwide amelioration of democratic politics if one understands politics as good democratic governance with the three actors of private sector, NGOs, and the traditional democratic politics. Now you can ask, of course, what would be democratic with the private sector cooperating in these politics, and what would be democratic with the NGOs cooperating in that governance, because neither the private sector nor the NGOs are legitimized in the traditional sense of a democracy. There are no general elections, they have no legitimacy in that sense. Or, in the wording of political science, they have no input legitimacy. They might have output legitimacy. That means the results of their activities, if they are common good oriented, might create a sense of legitimacy for them because they contribute to realize values which are strengthening legitimacy. We know that legitimacy is grounded either by procedures or by values, and justice belongs to these values. So we have the situation that the traditional sector of politics has input legitimacy, but very often not output legitimacy anymore, because people don't think that they really do and implement what they should do. That the civil society has no input legitimacy, but has a certain amount of output legitimacy, a number of these civil society organizations, and that the private sector has power and influences the world in a way which for a long while couldn't be reached anymore by democratic politics. Of course, you could ask yourself, why should the private sector be interested in democratic politics and in good governance? Because it might be more effective if it is not disturbed by politics. But in the present situation, we see that even the private sector needs desperately politics in order to go on. And many people who are in charge of the private sector have for long discovered that their long-time interest is also oriented to the guarantee of security and liberty in the sense of the rule of the law, of social stability, etc. So I think this is why, for a long while already, a number of new organizations have risen, which try to implement democratic politics in that sense of tri-actor cooperation. I would like just to give you some examples in order to try to convince you that this is not mere imagination and fantasy I'm talking about. There is an organization in the United States which is called GAN, Global Action Network. This organization contains about 60 groups of actors, always from the three sectors, private sector, NGO, and state, traditional politics, and which do not act as anti-capitalist actors, but who accept the market and try to implement new rules. For instance, enforcing the rule of law in Cambodia. So you have a group of lawyers who try to cooperate with Cambodian governments and with the private sector in order to implement the base for the rule of law. And you can see that it makes a difference, because the various provinces of Cambodia, you see that 2 or 3 are working quite well, and this is the space where these 3 actors have worked together and in the others not. One of these activities I happen to know much better. It's called Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. It's not Transparency International, but it's very close. This is an initiative which has been brought forward by civil society actors. And for a number of 3 years, or 4, a group of people from the private sector, from the state, north and south, and from NGOs, has worked out rules in order to get transparency into the concession payments of big firms who want to participate and to take profit out of the extractive sector. The firms which are part of this initiative are so small firms like Esso and Shell and BP and Chevron and I mean all the big companies who are working in Africa and Asia. We haven't yet in it Gazprom and we haven't yet in it China. But we have a lot of these big firms. And they have signed 2 years ago an agreement saying we want to implement these rules which publish what the companies pay to the states so that the money, and these are billions for instance per year for Congo or for Angola, so that the state can't just take the money and have an army paid or private profits, but they have to put it into the budget. It's not put into the budget until now. And when they have put it into the budget, then the states can decide if they want to make out of it education progress, health service progress, or whatsoever. Why is this cooperation between the three actors favorable? The states on their own are not trustworthy because they want to have the money and to put it somewhere, ministers, whatsoever. The companies for themselves are not trustworthy neither because they want to have good deals. But the civil society is interested in having progress in these countries. So there are the watchdogs and also those who put together coalitions. For the moment, about 25 states and these big companies have signed this agreement, and now, state by state, they are checked if they have really been compliant to what they have signed. This is difficult, because who would you trust? You have always delegations, you have Wirtschaftsprüfer, you have civil society organizations. They are not always on unanimity about what judgment they have about their government. But you can, step by step, try to find out what would be an evaluation of the behavior of the state and the big companies. The World Bank and the World Monetary Fund are backing that initiative. Our government is backing it. The G8 meeting in Germany and also the last one in Japan has backed it. And the last interesting point was that Iraq is interested to participate in it, probably pushed by the United States. And if Iraq really becomes part of that initiative, then Gazprom has to behave following these rules, because they want large fields in Iraq and they have then to behave and to follow the rules if Iraq doesn't. So that you can, at the beginning it is a voluntary act, but if you are in it, you are obliged to follow the rules. If you want to stay a partner in that play. And the risk, if you don't follow them, is that you are publicly criticized. So the public space is an extremely important institution. And as the reputation capital is a very important capital for big companies and for states, to be blamed in the public space not to have behaved in conformity to what you have signed is a risk the big companies don't want to run. So I think this is a way, very difficult one, to develop democratic politics in a world where nation states, of course, have still a large part, and also Union of Nation States as a European Union, and many international organizations. But the idea to just transform the nation state to an international level and to have, so to say, an international state is certainly naive. You can't do it this way. This way of cooperating is not so clear, is not so there is no monopoly of violence, of course not. The last resort is the public sphere. And I remember that in the Federalist Papers, when Madison asked what would be the last guarantee that the institutionalization of the House of Representatives will not permit particularistic interests to win, he names a number of things, and at the end he says, but the free and manly spirit of the American people will save it. So it is a cultural institution. It is not an organizational institution. When I was in Colombia last year in Latin America, I asked NGOs why their private sector is interested to be part of that group, and they are interested, and they are doing it. They are part of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. The idea is quite clear. They said they are so insecure concerning their investments because there is a Chavez and there are other people in Latin America who threaten them to overcome and to overthrow, that they don't want to have this deep risk for their investments, and therefore they want from the beginning to prevent any risk and to cooperate with the civil society, which is more reliable than the present government. And so I think there are levers to push institutions and groups who are not from the beginning interested in such a democratic governance, to push to be part of it and to regain ground for political decision-making. As been shown, and you are right, Mr. Tiger, that the time has gone out, and I think I will just leave it here, and maybe we can, during the discussion, a little bit elaborate on it. Thank you.